The morning sun cast golden hues over the grand entrance of the city courthouse, illuminating its marble pillars and wide stone steps. Judge Daniel Carter adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit as he walked toward the entrance, briefcase in hand. He had been serving in this courthouse for years, delivering justice with fairness and wisdom. Despite the weight of his responsibilities, he found solace in the thought that he was making a difference. As he neared the entrance, a white police officer, Mark Reynolds, stationed by the door, caught sight of him. Reynolds had been with the force for over a decade, priding himself on his ability to keep the courthouse secure. But as he observed the approaching man, a flicker of doubt surfaced in his mind. His grip on his radio tightened. Something about the man didn't sit right with him. With measured steps, Reynolds moved forward, blocking the path to the entrance. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice firm, his expression unreadable. "Can I see some identification?" Judge Carter halted in his tracks, blinking in mild surprise. He had walked through these doors countless times. Everyone here knew him. Well, almost everyone, apparently. He adjusted his glasses and studied the officer. "Excuse me," he asked, keeping his voice calm despite the irritation stirring inside him. Reynolds squared his shoulders. "This area is restricted. I need to verify who you are." A pause. A brief, heavy silence. Carter measured his words before speaking. "Officer, I am Judge Daniel Carter. I work in this courthouse." Reynolds' expression remained unchanged. He had been trained not to take people at their word. Protocol demanded verification. But more than that, a stubborn part of him refused to let go of his initial suspicion. "I'll still need to see some ID, sir," he said. Carter inhaled deeply, suppressing the frustration that now gnawed at him. He was no stranger at moments like these, but it never got easier. The reality of what was happening settled over him like a familiar but unwelcome weight. Despite his position, despite the years he had spent proving himself, despite the respect he commanded in the courtroom, out here, on these courthouse steps, he was just another black man under scrutiny. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd inside. Several courthouse officials who recognized Carter glanced through the glass doors, their faces shifting from confusion to concern. Carter opened his briefcase, retrieved his ID, and handed it over with controlled precision. "Here," he said, his voice even. "My identification." Reynolds took the card, glancing at it, and then back at Carter, realization dawning. The truth of his mistake settled in his gut like a lead weight. Before he could speak, a voice called out from behind. "Judge Carter, good morning." It was one of his colleagues, a fellow judge, stepping outside. Others followed, their eyes darting between the officer and Carter. Recognition flickered in Reynolds' expression, followed closely by embarrassment. He felt his pulse quicken, the heat rising to his face. The man he had just questioned, the man he had doubted, wasn't an outsider at all. He was one of the most respected figures in this courthouse. Judge Carter reclaimed his ID and slid it back into his briefcase, exhaling softly. He could see the shift in Reynolds' demeanor. The hesitation, the realization, the shame. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Judge Carter, I apologize. I didn't realize." Carter held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. He could see the turmoil in the officer's face, the battle between pride and regret. He had seen it before. Too many times. "This," Carter said carefully, "is why it is important to recognize people for their merits, not just their appearances." Reynolds nodded slowly, swallowing hard. He wanted to say more, to explain himself, but no words seemed sufficient. Instead, he simply said, "I understand, and I'm sorry." Carter studied him for a long moment before offering a slight nod. "Good. Then I hope this is something you'll remember." With that, he turned and walked into the courthouse, the doors closing behind him. As he strode down the familiar hallways, the encounter lingered in his mind. He was used to challenges in the courtroom, where the law was his battlefield. But out there, just steps away from the very place where he upheld justice, he had been reduced to just another suspect. And that was the part that stung the most. Reynolds stood at his post, the courthouse doors shutting behind Judge Carter. He exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. He had prided himself on being a fair officer, a man who protected and served without bias. But today he had failed. He had let assumptions guide his actions, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had stopped plenty of people at this entrance before. But why had he questioned Carter? Was it because he was unfamiliar with him? Or was it something else, something deeper, more insidious? The questions gnawed at him. Inside the courthouse, Judge Carter made his way to his chambers. He loosened his tie and sat at his desk, rubbing his temples. This wasn't the first time he had been misjudged, and he doubted it would be the last. He had spent years fighting against the biases embedded in the justice system. But no matter how many cases he ruled on, how many decisions he made in the pursuit of fairness, out there, beyond the courtroom doors, he was still subject to the same prejudices as any other black man. And that was exhausting. That evening, Reynolds found himself looking up Judge Carter online. He read about his career, his rulings, the impact he had made in the community. The more he read, the more foolish he felt. This man was everything he claimed to respect. So why had he doubted him? The realization settled heavily on him. His mistake hadn't been an accident. It had been a bias, and he needed to confront it. The next morning, Judge Carter arrived at the courthouse, his mind still occupied with the events of the previous day. But as he approached the steps, he was surprised to see Officer Reynolds standing there, waiting for him. The officer stepped forward, his face solemn. "Judge Carter," he said, "I owe you an apology." Carter paused, studying him. He could tell by Reynolds' expression that this wasn't just a forced formality. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Yesterday, I made an assumption, and I was wrong. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I want to thank you for showing me a better way to handle things. I'll be more aware of my actions moving forward." Carter took a slow breath. He had been on the receiving end of countless apologies before, some sincere, some empty. But this one felt different. He nodded. "It takes courage to admit a mistake, officer. I hope you'll take this experience and use it to challenge any assumptions you might have moving forward." "I will," Reynolds promised. They shook hands, a simple gesture, but one that carried weight. And just like that, a small but important change had begun. In the weeks that followed, both men carried the lessons of that day with them. Reynolds made a conscious effort to challenge his own biases, undergoing additional training and engaging with the community in ways he hadn't before. He saw people differently, not as profiles to be assessed, but as individuals with stories, with merit. Judge Carter, too, found himself more resolute than ever. He continued mentoring young professionals, teaching them not just about the law, but about grace, patience, and resilience. Their encounter had started as a moment of tension, but it had become something more. A turning point, a lesson, and perhaps the beginning of real change.